In 1921, a Swiss psychiatrist named Carl Gustav Jung published a book of nearly 700 pages called Psychological Types. In it, he mapped out 8 different ways the human mind functions. 100 years later, 7 of them are still reasonably well understood. One has turned into a stigma. People confuse it sometimes with shyness, sometimes with persistent low spirits, sometimes with social withdrawal. It has a proper name, the introverted intuitive. And I've stopped counting how many people of this type are, in silence, pulling away from modern life. In this video, with the help of Jung and Friedrich Nietzsche, we're going to discuss what lives inside someone who feels that urge. Have you ever felt like a stranger in a room full of your own family? Have you ever come home tired, not from work, but from the effort of still looking like a normal person? Before we dive in, a quick heads up. Shyness is not introversion. Sadness is not introversion. What lives here is something older and harder to name. Picture the scene. A birthday party on a Sunday afternoon. Kids running around, adults repeating the same questions, somebody pouring soda into a plastic cup. You're there, present in body, with that polished smile you've learned to keep in your pocket for occasions like this. Inside, though, there's a strange emptiness. It's not sadness, it's not anger. It's the odd feeling of watching a movie where all the actors agreed on a script and nobody told you it even existed. You watch your uncle talking loudly about football, while your cousin checks her phone every 20 seconds and your aunt asks for the 5th time when you're going to get married. And you notice something nobody else in the room seems to catch. There's a layer of polite dishonesty hovering over the table. Everyone is pretending to be interested in each other, repeating phrases nobody actually feels, with that protocol-grade enthusiasm that doesn't fool anyone with a sharp ear. And you, instead of feeling angry about it, feel a tiredness that goes far beyond the physical, an exhaustion of the soul, an almost uncontrollable urge to leave without having to explain yourself. At work, it's similar. The Monday meeting starts with lukewarm jokes, climbs into a motivational speech with no real motivation behind it, and ends with goals nobody believes in. You stay quiet, jot down half of what's said, notice the glances exchanged between coworkers, sense who's lying about their numbers, sense who's faking enthusiasm. You even sense what the boss didn't say, and you walk out of there with a headache that has nothing to do with the coffee. In a family conversation, it's the same thing. You're sitting on the couch, listening to your mom talk about the neighbor, your dad flipping through channels, somebody commenting on the 8 o'clock news. On the surface, everything looks normal, but you're picking up on a discomfort nobody names. Your brother's contained irritation, your mother's disguised sadness, your father's silence that says more than any word ever could, and you wonder if you're seeing too much, or if everyone else is seeing too little. What if that feeling isn't a problem with you, but a sign of something you perceive and others don't? What if that quiet getaway you make every single time isn't weakness, but a very old form of protection? To understand this properly, we need to go back to a man who changed the history of psychology. In 1921, the Swiss psychiatrist Carl Gustav Jung published a book called Psychological Types. It was in this work that he coined terms that everyone uses today without knowing where they came from: introversion, extroversion, intuitive function. Jung didn't invent these types to label anyone. He invented them to show that there are profoundly different ways the human mind operates, and that treating them all as if they were the same is an old and cruel mistake. Introversion, for Jung, is not shyness, not fear of people, much less difficulty speaking in public. Introversion is a direction of energy. The introvert's energy turns inward first, then outward. Before reacting to the world, he has to cross an inner landscape. Before speaking, he has to understand. Before acting, he has to feel. It's not slowness, it's a different physics of the soul. And there's a type within the type, the introverted intuitive. Jung described this profile as someone whose perception doesn't grab onto the visible first, but the invisible. He doesn't look at the table, he looks at the emotional climate of the table. He doesn't hear the words, he hears what's hiding between them. He doesn't live in the fact, he lives in the symbol of the fact. For this person, an ordinary conversation carries layers. A common scene hides patterns. A silence says things noise could never manage to say. You can think of it this way. Most people function like a camera focused on the details in the foreground. The introverted intuitive functions like a radar that picks up movement on the horizon long before any camera could focus on it. He senses what's coming, perceives what's shifting, intuits what hasn't yet taken shape. And this isn't some psychic gift. It isn't mystical. It isn't superiority. It's a specific way the psyche relates to reality, mapped out and named by Jung more than 100 years ago. The problem is that this mode is rare. And rare, in the middle of many, looks strange. And what looks strange tends to get pushed off to the side. That's why so many people like this grow up hearing that they think too much, that they're too sensitive, that their head's in the clouds, that they need to loosen up. And they keep swallowing each of those lines until they start to believe there's something wrong with them. When, in reality, there's just something different about them. And different has never been a synonym for defective. There's something nobody tells you about this finer perception. It charges a price. You feel the emptiness behind the smiles, the hypocrisy behind the pretty speech, the exhaustion behind the fake cheerfulness. And you feel all of that while you politely smile and say everything's fine. Jung observed that introverted intuition tends to pick up on the collective unconscious, in other words, the unspoken moods, the hidden tendencies, the truths the group has silently agreed never to face. That explains why so many people like this feel lonely, even in the middle of a crowd. It's not a lack of company. It's an overload of information. While the others are skimming the surface of the conversation, talking about the weather and the latest TV show, you're picking up 10 channels at once. The envy disguised as a compliment, the fear hidden inside the bravado, the insecurity dressed up as arrogance, the sadness wrapped in loud laughter. All of it reaches you without asking permission, and it weighs on you. There's an old word for this, lucidity, but maybe it would be more honest to call it uncomfortable lucidity, because clarity, when it comes in excess, doesn't set you free. It isolates you. You start to see things nobody wants to hear. You anticipate crises that everybody else will later swear caught them by surprise. You read the room like an open book, but the book, most days, is just too sad. And you're stuck in that strange position of someone who knows too much without ever having asked to know. The spiritual literature of many traditions has talked about this in other ways. Prophets were people who saw what hadn't yet appeared. Hermits walked away not because they hated life, but because they saw it with too much clarity. Today, without that old language, the introverted intuitive carries the same burden with no decent name to put on it. And what has no name hurts more. So the tiredness you feel at the end of the day isn't just from work. It's from the effort of inhabiting a body in one place and a mind in another. It's from the weight of processing layers while the rest of the world only deals with the surface. It's from the energy spent translating what you feel into a language others can hear, and discovering, in the middle of the translation, that a lot of it gets lost along the way. Now take this person, with this specific wiring, and drop him into the noisy machine of today's world. Open office spaces, a phone notification every 3 minutes, meetings that could have been emails, emails that could have been silences, the family group chat that never stops buzzing, mandatory networking, selfies everywhere, stories to prove you're still alive, loud voices on the bus, music leaking out of the headphones of the person next to you, 5 tabs open in the browser of your mind, all of them demanding attention. Contemporary culture was designed, without anyone realizing it, for a very specific psychological type, the extrovert who gets energized by external stimulation. The person who lights up at parties, at quick interactions, at constant exchanges, was favored by the architecture of this era. The person who needs silence to think, pauses to feel, retreats to create, became inadequate. Not because he's worse, but because the world picked a standard and treated everyone else as a factory defect. Jung already sensed something similar back in the first half of the last century. He observed that each psychological type has a specific energy limit, and that forcing an introvert to live like an extrovert is the same as asking a fish to breathe out of water. It works for a few minutes. Then comes the burnout. And chronic burnout turns into symptoms, which usually end up in some generic prescription, when, deep down, the problem was never chemical, it was environmental. Here's an important shift. Your tiredness might not be persistent low spirits. It might be structural overload. It might be the fatigue piled up from years of trying to function in a system that wasn't built for you. It's not a weakness of character. It's not a lack of willpower. It's not laziness in disguise. It's the bill that arrives after years of performing a version of yourself that was never really yours. And the worst part is that there's a quiet pressure telling you to pretend everything is fine. You're supposed to enjoy parties, supposed to love meetings, supposed to be thrilled to meet new people, supposed to post more on social media, supposed to go out more, supposed to reply faster, supposed to be more. That supposed to lives inside you like a tenant who never pays rent and never shuts up. And every time you give into it, you lose a little more of yourself. This is where Friedrich Nietzsche enters the story. At the end of the 19th century, this German philosopher wrote a strange and incredibly powerful work called Thus Spoke Zarathustra. In it, he described modern man as someone who was running away. But running away from what? From himself. Nietzsche observed that life in the big city, with its constant noise, its uninterrupted entertainment, its mandatory hustle, served less to amuse people and more to numb them. The modern man doesn't stay in silence because silence frightens him. In silence, he'd have to face himself, and facing himself hurts. For someone who needs quiet to think, this world is, literally, suffocating. Imagine trying to hear a whisper inside a stadium packed for a championship final, or trying to spot a star under a neon sign, or trying to read a book on a plane with a child screaming next to you. That's roughly what the introverted intuitive faces every single day just to get through ordinary tasks. The environment is calibrated to a volume that injures his perception. And then comes the more uncomfortable part. It's not just the noise of cars, of music, of car horns. It's mental noise. It's the digital chatter that comes pouring through the screen in the form of a new outrage every day. It's the obligation to have an opinion on everything. It's the manufactured urgency to respond now, to comment now, to react now. Inner silence has become a luxury. And luxury, in this country, has always been the privilege of a few. Have you ever noticed the weight that lifts when you spend a whole weekend without checking your phone? At first comes anxiety, then relief, then a strange stillness that feels fake because you're not used to it. That initial discomfort is the symptom of how much noise you've stored up, like mildew on a wall. You only notice it when you finally open the window and the air comes in. In Zarathustra, Nietzsche described a figure that would become famous, the last man. This symbolic character represented the kind of person modernity was producing in bulk. The last man doesn't want great things, doesn't want depth, doesn't want risk. He only wants comfort. He wants small, regular pleasures, constant security, enough distractions to keep him from thinking. He despises everything tragic, everything deep, everything that demands an effort of the soul. And the most unsettling thing about Nietzsche's description is that the last man doesn't see himself that way. He believes he's living well. He believes he's the final form of human progress. When the introverted intuitive looks around and feels that discomfort he can't quite name, he's picking up on exactly that without knowing it. It's not that he hates people. It's that he perceives an entire society shaping itself to the standard of the last man. A society that applauds the shallow and ridicules the deep, that celebrates entertainment and despises reflection, that measures success in likes and ignores anything that can't be turned into content. And feeling that, without being able to explain it, is feeling a silent betrayal against something very ancient inside himself. You're not running away from people. You're running away from a mediocrity that has become the collective ideal. You're running away from the hurry that suffocated contemplation, from the exposure that erased intimacy, from the appearance that erased the truth. And that retreat, seen from the outside, looks antisocial. Seen from the inside, it's an instinct for preservation, like an animal stepping out of the clearing when it picks up a strange smell on the wind. There's a scene that repeats itself in the life of someone like this. You arrive somewhere new. It takes you 5 minutes to feel out the room, and you already have a complete read on what's going on. You know who's tired and who's lying. You spot who's suffering in silence and who's trying way too hard to impress. And you didn't ask to know. It came on its own, like vision adjusting in the dark. That's the heavy side of the introverted intuitive function Jung described. It comes with an almost painful sensitivity, with an antenna that catches signals before they ever turn into audible noise. People like this tend to sense crises before they blow up. They feel a friend's marriage falling apart long before the divorce. They sense the layoff before the official notice, and they anticipate shifts in collective mood well before the headline confirms it. And most of the time, they're ignored, or worse, mocked. When the thing actually happens, nobody remembers that they called it. Or they remember with even more anger, as if the announcement had caused the event. There's a phrase that captures this feeling well: being awake in a sleeping world, not in the pretentious sense of superiority, but in the literal sense of catching movement in a landscape that the other person sees as standing still. And that's lonely in a way few people understand. Because you can't share a perception nobody else has had. You can't describe a color only you are seeing. You're left with the information in your mouth. It goes sour. It turns into silence, into distance, into this retreat that nobody understands. And here comes an important point that needs to be said without softening. I know it's hard to hear this, but living with this kind of sensitivity without understanding what it is turns into silent suffering. A lot of people like this spend their entire lives thinking they're crazy, weird, broken. They go from therapist to therapist, from treatment to treatment. They read one self-help book after another. And what they really need, deep down, is just to know there's a name for it. It's not a disease. It's a type. And types don't get cured. They get known. Before we move on, here's a question hanging in the air. If this perception is an ancient instinct, why do so many people feel they have to run from it? Where is the soul trying to take you when it keeps asking for silence? Solitude is a tough subject because it has two faces: an ugly face that suffocates and a quiet face that heals. And learning to tell those two apart might be one of the most important tasks of adult life. Jung was clear about this. He said, at different points throughout his work, that imposed solitude is poison, but chosen solitude is medicine. It's not the amount of time alone that defines the thing. It's the intention with which that stillness is inhabited. Imposed solitude is the kind that arrives as punishment. It's the solitude of the forgotten elderly, of the newly divorced, of the migrant without a network, of the teenager left out. That one is cruel because it comes without being wanted by the person living it. It settles in as lack, as a hole, as absence, and it can wear someone down deeply. That's not the one we're talking about. Chosen solitude is something else. It's the kind you seek out, the kind you miss, the kind you need the way you need water. It's the Sunday afternoon with the door closed, the book open, the coffee going cold, and no desire to explain yourself to anyone. It's the long walk with no headphones, no destination, no company. It's the quiet bedroom after a loud week. That solitude doesn't empty you out. It fills you up. Nietzsche also saw solitude as a space for creation. To him, deep thought could only be born far from the noise of the marketplace, far from easy opinions, far from the crowd that confuses agreement with truth. He himself spent stretches alone in the mountains, in simple houses, writing between long walks, not out of eccentricity, but because he knew creation requires a kind of quietness the collective destroys. The introverted intuitive, when he pulls back, is rarely running away from people. He's going to find himself. He's trying to hear an inner voice that the noisy routine has been drowning out. He's trying to recover a way of thinking that gets diluted in too much conversation. Stepping back, for him, is like recharging a battery nobody else can see, but that is always nearly empty. It's a biological necessity before it's a philosophical choice. There's another thing weighing on this person, and Jung gave it a name: persona. The persona is the mask each of us wears to fit into the world. It's not a bad thing in itself. Everyone has one. You've got the son persona, the worker persona, the bar friend persona, the college classmate persona. It's useful. It allows the social gears to turn without every single interaction becoming an intimate confession. The problem starts when the persona becomes a prison. When you forget it's a mask and start to believe it's your face. For anyone, keeping the persona on all day is tiring. For the introverted intuitive, it tears him apart. Because the persona he has to wear in the world tends to be light years away from his inner world. He performs enthusiasm while he feels exhaustion. He carries on small talk while he's thinking about big things. He fakes interest in the trivial while his mind is heading somewhere else entirely. Every hour he spends keeping up that character is an hour spent far from himself. And the body collects the debt. You get headaches with no clear cause. You get a tight throat. You get tiredness that sleep can't shake. You get sudden bursts of irritation toward people you love. You get an urge to cry out of nowhere. The body is honest. It hands you the bill that the soul has been holding for weeks. And when you finally allow yourself an afternoon alone, in silence, without having to be anything to anyone, you feel the relief almost physically, like taking off a tight shoe after hours on your feet. There's a line from Jung that often gets passed around out of context, but that makes a lot of sense here. The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you are. For this psychological type, that privilege comes at a steep price. Because society will offer you, on every corner, a ready-made version to slip into, and you'll have to turn down a lot of those offers if you want, in the end, to still recognize the face in the mirror. When you start to pull away from the noise, something strange happens. The things the noise was drowning out start to surface. Old grudges, buried fears, desires you didn't even know you had. Fragments of your own story that seemed long settled come back asking for attention. That encounter with what's inside was one of Jung's central themes. He called this denied part of ourselves the shadow. The shadow isn't evil. It isn't a demon. It isn't trauma. It's everything the conscious personality left out as it was forming. Everything you decided was too bad, too shameful, too dangerous to keep in you. As you grow up, those pieces get pushed into a dark corner of the psyche, and they sit there waiting. And when the silence finally comes, they come up too. That's why a lot of people, when they try to pull back, end up running away even more. They turn on the TV, open the phone, put a show on in the background, schedule a hangout, have a few drinks. They do anything not to stay still. Because staying still means standing face to face with what the noise was hiding, and that's scary. It's less painful to deal with external sound pollution than with internal emotional pollution. Here's one of the differences between running away and retreating. The surface-level escape pulls you away from people and hands you over to the same noise, only now indoors. You swap the open office for the endless feed, the party for the binge watch, the shallow conversation for the automatic scroll. You stay distant, but you stay asleep. A true retreat is different. It takes courage. You pull back from the external noise and from the internal noise too. You agree to sit alone with your shadow. You agree to see what was hidden. And it's exactly that encounter that transforms you. You don't have to do this in any particular way or at the pace some self-help book tells you to. It can be one long walk a week, a morning without your phone, a notebook where you write things nobody will ever read, a longer shower in silence. What matters is not running from the stillness, because that's where everything else is going to show up. Nietzsche had a pretty harsh phrase for this phenomenon where the individual cancels himself out in the collective. He called it herd morality. The image is strong and deliberate. To him, most people think, feel, want, and fear as a herd. They believe what the herd believes. They despise what the herd despises. They go wherever the herd goes, and they mistake that for freedom, when in reality, it's just fear dressed up as belonging. I completely understand when you feel a hard-to-explain unease in the face of certain consensus opinions your circle defends with passion. It's not intellectual arrogance. It's the inner refusal to sign on to something just because everyone else has signed on. To Nietzsche, that unease is the first sign that an individual is being born. The person who dares to doubt the herd is the person who's beginning to truly exist. Before that, he was just a reflection, an echo, a repetition of what he had heard. Don't confuse this with being contrarian for sport. It's not. There are people who disagree with everything just out of spite, and that's another form of the herd, only flipped. The courage of separation Nietzsche talks about is different. It's the quiet courage of not clapping when everyone else is clapping if you didn't feel like clapping. It's the courage of not laughing when the laughter is forced. It's the courage of staying on your feet when everyone else sits down, and sitting down when everyone else stands up, without having to turn it into some kind of statement. For the introverted intuitive, this comes almost naturally. He doesn't really belong to any group. Surrounded by churchgoers, he senses something missing. Surrounded by skeptics, he senses something else missing. When he steps into a room full of revolutionaries, the feeling repeats. In every group, he picks up on the part nobody wants to admit. And that's why he pulls away. Not because he looks down on anyone. Because he knows that belonging too much means giving up on thinking. That distance, which looks arrogant from the outside, is, on the inside, an act of honesty. You leave because you can't keep pretending anymore. Because saying yes when you felt no was destroying you. Because the alternative was to keep performing a version of yourself that no longer served you. It's not social cowardice. It's the start of a faithfulness to yourself that few people have the courage to keep. It's completely valid to feel this. And it's also valid to not yet know what to do with that feeling. Because the vocabulary for it barely exists in mainstream culture. People will tell you to socialize more. They'll tell you to step out of your bubble. They'll suggest therapy, the gym, a trip, a new relationship. Everything except the one thing you actually need: permission to stay quiet long enough to understand what that quietness is asking of you. Here's a point not many people make. The urge to retreat, in the introverted intuitive, isn't a sickness. It's an instinct. It's the psyche trying to protect its core, the way the body pulls away from a hot coal before you've even processed the burn. Jung would say that this spontaneous withdrawal is a legitimate response from a soul that feels its center under threat. I'm not saying this to make you anxious. I'm saying it to wake you up. You don't have to apologize for protecting what's most valuable inside you. Think of a garden. If the gate stays open all the time, anyone walks in. They trample the flowers without noticing. They throw trash where the plants used to be. They throw a party right on the soft soil. After a while, the garden turns into hard-packed dirt. There's nothing wrong with closing the gate on certain days. There's nothing wrong with choosing who comes in. It's not hostility toward the world. It's care for the piece of land that was given to you. The soul works the same way. If you leave it open to every stimulus, every conversation, every scene, it slowly turns into trampled ground. It loses its ability to bloom. It becomes a place people just pass through. And then you start asking yourself why nothing moves you anymore, why everything feels the same, why life has lost its color. It wasn't life. It was the garden. It was the gate left open for too long. When the introverted intuitive pulls back, he's closing the gate from the inside. Not forever. For now. To give the soil time to rest. To give something time to grow back. And when someone on the outside calls that weakness, they're really just confessing they've never tended a garden of their own. But here's a point that needs to be said with the same honesty. Not every retreat is healing. Not every withdrawal is maturity. There's a point where the distance, which started as protection, turns into a prison. And anyone of this type has to stay alert to that, because the tendency is real, it's old, and it was described by Jung himself. Jung observed that the introvert can slip into pathological isolation, the kind where the inner world stops being a refuge and turns into a fortress. The walls that used to protect become walls that suffocate. Chosen solitude becomes solitude imposed on himself, by himself. The person loses the ability to come back. He gets stranger, sharper, more suspicious. He starts treating any touch from the outside world as an invasion. And then he falls into a cycle where every day spent alone makes the next day alone harder to break. That's a quiet and dangerous road. It starts looking like peace. It ends looking like emptiness. And a lot of people confuse the two feelings because chronic emptiness mimics surface peace. You're calm, but lifeless. Steady, but bloodless. Balanced, but with no desire. That's not deep meditation. That's anesthesia in disguise. Nietzsche also saw this risk. He warned that solitude, with no return, turns into resentment. The man who walks away and never comes back ends up building, inside himself, a story in which he's the only fair one, the only clear-eyed one, the only one who's right. Everything out there becomes foolishness. Everyone becomes guilty. And he, in the middle of that lonely narrative, starts to dry out. He loses his capacity for affection, for change, for surprise. He becomes a bitter judge in a court where no defendants ever show up. It's not an inevitable fate, but it's a real trap. And recognizing the trap is part of the work. You retreat because you need to, but retreating can't be the final destination. It has to be a pit stop. It has to be a workshop where the inner machine gets repaired. It can't be a permanent address. Whoever lives forever in the pause forgets to live in between the pauses. One of the early symptoms of that dangerous turn is when you start looking down on those who are still in the middle of the noise. When, in your head, everyone else becomes shallow, dumb, lost, while you, in your supposed clarity, are the only one who sees. That's the first stage of resentment. And the more you feed that contempt, the lonelier you get. Not in a good way, in a bitter way. Another symptom is the loss of curiosity. You stop wanting to learn new things, meet new people, go to new places. Everything already feels known, predictable, shallow. That premature exhaustion with life isn't wisdom. It's a retreat that has tipped over into burnout. Then silence stops being a wellspring and turns into a pit. So the right question isn't whether you should pull away. It's how you should pull away. With a planned return or with no way back. With a foot in the exit door or with the door sealed shut. Like a hiker who goes up the mountain and comes back, or like a hermit who never walks back down. The first option transforms. The second paralyzes. And here, before the final stretch, an important reminder. If you're enjoying this content, check out the first comment for our exclusive ebook, Alchemy and Archetypes. Carl Jung's great contribution to depth psychology wasn't naming types. It was showing that there is a path he called individuation. That word carries weight. It's worth understanding it slowly. Individuation, in Jungian language, is the process by which a person becomes, over the course of their life, who they truly are. Not who their parents wanted them to be. Not who school molded them into. Not who their group of friends expects. Not who the algorithm rewards. But who, in the center of the soul, they have always been, and have not yet fully managed to bring out. It's a long job, done in silence, costly, and few people complete it. That process requires integrating parts that life pulled apart. The persona has to become a conscious mask, not an involuntary face. The shadow has to be faced, not banished. The conscious and the unconscious need to talk to each other instead of ignoring each other. And for all of that to happen, you need one ingredient modern life has made extremely rare: quality time spent inside yourself. That's why the introverted intuitive's retreat, when done well, isn't running away. It's a necessary stage of individuation. He pulls back from the noise not to vanish, but to finally be able to hear the whisper that was always there, hidden by the storm. He retreats in order to be born. He steps away from the crowd in order to start to exist. This path isn't linear. There are good days and there are awful days. There are weeks of clarity and months of confusion. There are moments where you feel like you're finding yourself, and moments where you feel more lost than before. That's part of the process. Anyone who promises you a straight road to the final version of yourself is selling you an illusion. Individuation looks more like a spiral, slowly climbing upward, than like a straight set of stairs. And here's one of the most beautiful parts of what Jung described. As that process moves forward, the sensitivity that used to be a burden starts to become a tool. That fine perception of the environment, once noisy and painful, starts to get directed. You learn to choose where to place your attention, to close certain channels, to open others that used to seem invisible. The intuition that used to hurt you with overload starts to guide you through conscious use. What used to be invasion becomes instrument. And you discover that the world, which felt too hostile, has spaces of belonging you just hadn't found yet. There are people out there somewhere breathing at the same rhythm as you, jobs that value the kind of perception you've always had, communities where your way of thinking isn't a flaw, it's the center. You just didn't know yet, because you were too busy trying to fit into places you were never going to fit. Nietzsche had a formula that sums all of this up in a brutal and beautiful way. He used it in his work, Ecce Homo, whose subtitle is, fittingly, How One Becomes What One Is. And it goes like this: become who you are. 4 words. A lifetime of work. Notice the subtlety. It's not become who you want to be, or become who they taught you to be. It's not an identity project, a character build, a personal brand decision. It's something very different. It's letting go of everything you are not, until what's left is what you truly are. It's work of subtraction, not addition. You don't turn into someone new. You discover, beneath the layers, what was always there waiting to come out. For the introverted intuitive, this Nietzschean formula lands with a special weight, because he's spent his whole life hearing he needs to be more sociable, more upbeat, more talkative, more outgoing. Each of those pressures was another coat of paint over what he really was. Becoming who he is, for him, means scraping off those layers, going back to the original wood, accepting that his nature is something else, and stopping the apology for it. The synthesis between Jung and Nietzsche, at this point, is sharp. Jung describes the process, individuation. Nietzsche gives the command, become. The two point in the same direction, toward a dive into yourself that only completes itself when the diver comes back up, changed, with something in his hand worth bringing along. There is, however, one detail that needs to be said clearly to avoid misunderstanding. Becoming who you are doesn't mean becoming harder to be around. It doesn't mean collecting eccentricities. It doesn't mean cultivating the character of a deep thinker while your practical life slowly turns into a mess. Real individuation usually comes alongside more tenderness, more patience, and more listening, never less. The person who becomes what he is, paradoxically, has less to spare for others and becomes more whole for himself. Real life starts when the inner work finds an outer form. Understanding isn't enough. You have to create. It can be a craft, a child you raise differently, a book, a vegetable garden, a way of caring for the people close to you. The retreat has to become an offering, otherwise, it gets wasted. The introverted intuitive who knows himself well becomes someone who sees what others don't see and gives it back to the world in some shape or form. This brings us to where all of this has been pointing. There's an ancient pattern, found in myths all over the world, that describes this journey clearly. The hero leaves, crosses the desert, finds himself in the middle of nowhere, and the hero returns. He always returns. It's not the departure that closes the cycle, it's the return. Leaving with no return is exile. Returning with no leaving is repetition. The cycle only closes when the person leaves, transforms, and comes back. The introverted intuitive wasn't made to live forever on the margins, but he also wasn't made to dissolve in the center until he turns into just another voice in an undefined chorus. His path is the transformed return, pulling back enough to find his own shape, and coming back enough to offer the world what only he, in the silence he chose, was able to see. Think about all the thinkers, artists, founders, and caregivers who changed something in the course of ordinary lives. Almost none of them did it while they were glued to the crowd. Almost all of them went through a period of retreat before the offering, and almost all of them came back. They brought something with them. They left something behind. They didn't settle for keeping the silence just for themselves. That's the gesture that closes the cycle. The withdrawal serves the offering. The listening serves the voice. The retreat serves the return. You don't have to become a famous thinker or the founder of some great thing to make that return. The offering can be small. It can be a deep conversation with a sibling who needed to be heard without being judged. It can be a way of doing your job with more attention than was asked of you. It can be a letter to someone who needed real words. It can be a more patient way of raising your children. What matters is that something from the silence you cultivated turns into presence in the world. That it doesn't stay locked away as silent superiority. There's a subtle difference between the person who comes back full of himself and the person who comes back full of something. The first one shows up arrogant, wanting to teach everyone. He wears people out. He pushes them away. He creates distance. The second one comes back quiet, with that dense presence of someone who has seen things and doesn't need to announce it. Nobody forgets that one. Not because of what he said, because of what he was. And what he was got built in exactly that time when he was gone. So the final turn is this. Your urge to pull away isn't a sickness. It isn't weakness. It isn't a pathological withdrawal. It isn't trauma. It's the instinct of a soul that perceives too much, feels too early, needs more silence than average. There's nothing wrong with you. There's something rare about you. And the rare has always been misread by the common. But your urge to pull away, also isn't a destination. It's not an address. It's not an excuse to disappear forever. It's a stage. It's a process. It's the start of a journey that only completes itself when you come back, transformed, with something in your hand worth offering. The retreat was the medicine. The return is life. And here's the question that might be the most important one of all. Are you running away from the world, or are you building the version of yourself that the world doesn't yet deserve? Because a flight ends in dust. But a construction, even a silent one, even a slow one, even one nobody around you believes in, always ends up becoming a work. And a work, when it returns to the world, leaves a mark. If this content touched you in some way, if it lit up something that had been dark for too long, leave your like on the video, subscribe to the channel to keep walking this road with us, and consider joining our members club, where the conversation goes deeper, more intimate, and more focused on those who are, like you, set on becoming who they really are. This channel exists for that specific kind of person, and maybe that kind is exactly yours.